Start. You may turn it on. We're here to hear the Rabbi speak tonight on David and Bathsheba. Now, I don't have to introduce our favorite Rabbi because we all know who he is, right? Okay, so next month there is not a movie. We will go to May and the movie will be on Ruth. So keep that in mind. Next month is a special month. We're going to serve the Seder Passover dinner. That's a dinner for you new people that you have to sign up for. You have to sign up with me. I take the reservations for that. You can use your dining dollars. It will be on April 8th. We will gather in here at 4:30. We take half the room. So think about it. I'm going to start on Sunday talking about it, taking reservations. So you can use your dining dollars.
And it's limited to 36 people.
Unless we made one more.
Maybe 37.
I'm thinking one more table. Anyway, now, love this. Without further ado, Rabbi Panitz, we're so delighted that you're here.
What a splendid introduction. It's very good to see you, friends. I've really come to look forward to these monthly gatherings. We exchange ideas, we share some cultural perspectives, and there's such a warmth and camaraderie that characterizes these evenings. So I can tell you that my wife always knows that I'm going to return with a smile on my face and say, what a wonderful evening it was. Occasionally, I have to drive home through driving rain, but I don't think that's going to happen now. We have a sparkling day. Friends, quick show of hands, who has seen the film David and Bathsheba? Almost everyone in the room. And if you'd raise your hand again if you saw it recently. Again, most everyone in the room. Okay, so I think it must be fresh in people's memory. I have a fair amount to say about it, but let me begin by opening up to our full membership and just getting some of your first reactions to the film. Anyone want to share a first reaction to it? Ma'am.
My first reaction was it was as biblically correct, not chronological, but biblically correct of any of the ones that I have seen.
Well, I'll be speaking to that, indeed. The story of David and Bathsheba is, of course, a famous biblical story, and our movie screenplay centers on that, but I will be showing you some rather subtle ways in which 1951, rather than 2 Samuel, is in between the lines of the screenplay. But yes, it's certainly it's certainly closer to the biblical record than, for example, the Ten Commandments by DeMille. The Ten Commandments by DeMille introduces a completely spurious love triangle. Ramesses, Nefertari, Moses. That's not our Bible. Now, DeMille gets a lot of details right. The jewelry, the clothing, the look of ancient Egypt. But that's not the same thing as being fidelity to the Bible. Well, thank you. Other first comments? Yes, ma'am.
Should I?
That might help.
Louise, let me come.
I can yell pretty loud.
Well, we're recording it, so it's better if we have that with the microphone then.
I have been smiling since watching the movie last week. I saw that movie for the first time in 1951
Mhm.
when I was a rather young girl. But I was in a small town in South Carolina. The movie was open in the afternoons, and we would just go to the movies. I think I really didn't quite understand some of the finer points. I'm not sure I even knew about the birds and bees at that point. But it was a fun movie, so I did have an entirely different perspective when I saw it last week.
I'm glad.
Anyway, I just thought I'd share the perspective of a 12 or 13-year-old and a something 85-year-old. So it's just that I've just been thinking about how different my perspective is about the movie.
Quite so. And I would agree with you that this movie rewards repeated watching. There's there's a fair amount of depth in it that I hope to bring out. Maybe one more opening reaction, and then I'll go to my prepared remarks.
Anyone else want to say something?
Judy, you're getting your steps in this way. Do you have a Fitbit? Very good. All right. I want to begin by giving you the history of the production of the film. Because when we understand who was involved in it, it'll help us to analyze it. The filmmaker's name, and you may know this name, was Darrell F. Zanuck. Does that name ring a bell? Darrell F. Zanuck. He had worked his way up in the world of the Hollywood studio. He was a studio head already in the 1930s. And he left the famous Warner Brothers studio because, for very secular reasons, he had a salary dispute with Jack Warner. So he partnered with another movie entrepreneur, Joseph Schenck, to form 20th Century Pictures. And that company released its films through something called United Artists. You've probably heard of that. But they had another dispute over stock ownership. And Zanuck negotiated and used their studio to buy the bankrupt Fox Studios. And they created 20th Century Fox Film Corporation. You've heard of that, right? So that's how 20th Century Fox got created. Zanuck was the vice president of production of this new studio. And he had a very hands-on approach to the scripts, the film editing, and the producing. He was really not a distant manager, but he was close in. 1941, Pearl Harbor. America enters the Second World War. Zanuck serves honorably in the military. Comes back a changed man. And it shows in the movies that he worked on after 1945. I'm going to give you a short list of some of these films, and then we'll think about what binds those films together. 1947, Gentleman's Agreement. Remember that? 1949, remember the movie Pinky? That's less well known. How about All About Eve with Betty Davis, 1950? How about 12 O'Clock High, again with Gregory Peck, 1949? There's a common denominator to these films. They are unflinching, critical examinations of the various worlds that they're looking at. For example, 12 O'Clock High is an examination of how when the Air Force general is too close to the actual tactical mission, loses the big picture, he suffers a nervous breakdown, if you remember that from the film. A member of my congregation who retired as a lieutenant colonel in the US Air Force told me that 12 o'clock high is shown in the curriculum of the US Air Force Academy to teach the cadets about some of the dynamics of command. Isn't that interesting? So, Darryl Zanuck was a filmmaker who, after the Second World War, was not content to make fluff. He wanted critical examinations of the material that he was portraying. And I'm going to attempt to show you how that shows up in this film as well. You know that, as Calvin Coolidge said, the business of America is principally business. Coolidge was not a very eloquent man, but he said something about the American character. And it's certainly true for Hollywood. A Hollywood film had to turn a profit. Otherwise, it wouldn't be made. And if one of them was made that didn't turn a profit, the filmmaker might be out of a career. So there are certain expectations of the audience that go into these Hollywood films. 1951 is the middle of what's called the golden age of Hollywood. It ended in the 1960s because of the competition from television. But as we're thinking about right now, a young teenage girl, you didn't have a television in everyone's home. You went to the movies, and there was something playing every day. Sometimes you would get a little newsreel right, before the film. Right? Especially during the Second World War, the progress of the military effort, remember, that was all part of it. Now, 1949, very important year in the history of cinematic retellings of the Bible. 1949 was when the great filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille put out Samson and Delilah. In fact, I almost selected that one for our series, starring Hedy Lamarr and Victor Mature. Remember him? He did that for Paramount Pictures. Zanuck sees that film grossing all sorts of money, and he determines that he needs a Bible film as well. So he commissioned one of his cohort of screenwriters to work on it. And I want you to know about this man as well. His name was Philip Dunn. He was a screenwriter, a film director, producer, quite prolific. He was politically active during the Hollywood blacklist period. He was critical of Senator McCarthy and the House Un-American Affairs Committee and all of that witch hunting that was going on. Now, let me give you some of the screenplays that he wrote so that you can see that he's really a screenwriter of very top quality. And again, just quick show of hands if you've seen any of these movies. How Green Was My Valley, 1941. One of my favorites, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, lovely film, right? 1947. Christian film, The Robe, 1953. And the film about Michelangelo, The Agony and the Ecstasy, right? Isn't that Rex Harrison? Right? How can you not love it? Dunn received 2 Academy Award nominations One for screenwriting How Green Was My Valley, and the other one for this film, David and Bathsheba. Now, someone was telling me earlier that the film is not told in chronological sequence, but that David's youth, his work as a shepherd, his fight against Goliath, only shows up at the end of the film. And some of us were talking about that. There's a reason for that. Dunn tried to do one of these DeMille-style epics. You know that the Ten Commandments runs about 3.5 hours. Pack your lunch. Zanuck didn't want that. And he didn't want the DeMille type film, cast of thousands, huge battle scenes, spectacle. He didn't want that. He wanted a film that in some ways was less glitzy, but more hard-hitting. So he told Philip Dunn that a 4-hour film just wouldn't work. So Dunn's initial concept was the first part of this triptych would be David's youth and his fight against Goliath. The second part of the triptych would be David and Bathsheba. And the third part of the triptych would be the drama of David and his son Absalom and Absalom's rebellion. And Zanuck nixed that. So Dunn came back with another idea that it would be David and Bathsheba. He would focus on that, and David's youth would come in as a flashback. And that was the idea that he pitched, and Zanuck accepted that. So notice that this film is hard on the heels of Samson and Delilah, but its approach to biblical story retelling is very different. If you remember Samson and Delilah, the money shot, the big scene at the end is where Samson brings down the columns and the entire Philistine temple of Dagon comes crashing down. Do you remember that? Samson is blind, he's holding on to the pillars, he prays to God, his strength comes back, he pushes, and he brings down the temple upon all his enemies. DeMille actually built a partial scale model of the temple and a 30-some foot high full scale model of the temple. And so that was a spectacular approach to Bible storytelling. Zanuck didn't want that. And so this film doesn't have those. It does have high drama, but it doesn't involve that kind of glitzy effects. Now, using what we know, I'd like to analyze the film with you. And here's where I want to make the point that if you look at this film with a critical eye, the 1950s provenance comes out. So, between June of 1950 and 1953, America was involved in what conflict? The Korean conflict. In some ways, it was considered the forgotten war. Did not have the same broad popular buy-in that the Second World War had. Zanuck and Dunn, who were critical of the establishment, I believe that they were critical of 30-some thousand American soldiers dying in Korea. With that in mind, let me share this snippet from the dialogue. It's early in the film. King David's comments about warfare. Remember, early on, David has just returned from a scouting mission beneath the city walls of Rabbi. Joab, his general, checks to see if David is wounded. David grunts in pain. Joab, sire. David, Joab, you are wounded. Let me call the physician. David, no, no, let it alone. It's a long time since I've shed any blood. It's good to have proof that it still runs in my veins. I want you to think about that. That's a man who's somewhat cynical and self-deprecating. I don't even know if there's any blood running in my veins anymore. What does that mean? I've become an ice-cold monster? Is that the David that you know from the book of Samuel? Is that the David that you know from the book of Psalms? I don't think so. So it goes on. David says, we must decide on our strategy, for Rabbi is well defended. And then he turns to the young captain, who, if you know the Bible, know is the husband of Bathsheba, Uriah the Hittite, who is depicted as this kind of hoorah, gung-ho kind of a character, right? What would you do, Uriah? Uriah says, I can speak for them, sire, meaning for the men. Every man in the army would be glad to die for David. Now, what does David say in response to that? He says, 1,000 dead, perhaps 2, 1,000 vineyards and flocks left untended, 1,000 women wailing on my doorstep. This is an anti-war sentiment. Would you have thought of King David of the Bible as the author of an anti-war sentiment? David is a sinner, but he's not a scoffer in the Bible. You see that? So this is not the David of the Bible. This is a David as lensed by someone in the early 1950s of maybe progressive political sympathies. Now, it's much more like what you see in 12 O'Clock High by the same filmmaker, where 12 O'Clock High takes a potshot at unreflective patriotism. And by the way, the same lead actor, Gregory Peck, who worked often with Zanuck. Now, I want to spend some time tracing the character of David as it develops in this film. And this is one of the main points I want to make. David starts off as close to being cynical. He ends up being wholeheartedly repentant. That's the arc of his character development. So let me give you a scene from near the beginning of the film. The attendant at the court of David announces, Nathan, the prophet of God. And in walks Raymond Massey, great actor, right, with his fake beard. and he is the prophet Nathan. Nathan says, may God walk with David. And David says, it is his custom to walk with Nathan. That sounds like God's not walking with me much these days. See that? You don't expect that from the Bible. Now, David may say in Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? But he doesn't believe that God is just indifferent. That David's relationship with God is warm-blooded in the Bible. Here, it's like it's already post-breakup. He's not thinking about it very much anymore. That's surprising. That's not the David of the Bible. Nathan continues, God looks with favor on you to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. David's kind of bored. He says, excellent. Nathan says, but as to your intention of building a temple to receive the Ark, he's commanded me to say to you, thus speaks the Lord. And then this is a direct quote from the Bible. Should my servant David build me a house to dwell in? For I have not dwelt in a house since the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt, even to this day, but I have lived in a tent. Have I ever in all these years demanded that a temple be built for me? Now, therefore, I say to David, I took you from the pasture from guarding your sheep to make you shepherd over my people, even over all Israel. 2 Samuel chapter 7. David in the movie is kind of bored by all this. He says, yes, yes, I understand. God sees no need of a temple. Is that it? Nathan, that is his word. Nathan is somewhat miffed that David is not more attentive, more humbled. So David says, very well, I leave such decisions to you. Nathan says, to God, sire. And David says, whatever you like. Do you hear the cynicism in that? You may take full charge of the arrangements to bring the ark here from Baal, Judah. Okay, now, I want to give you a second example where it's, I think, even clearer. Later on in the film, after God is punishing the nation for David's sin, and there's drought and famine, you see the shepherd and his little boy suffering, right? The sandstorm, the animals are dying. Remember that part of the film? So this is after the scene where the priests were bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem on an ox cart, which, by the way, was a mistake. You should know from the book of Exodus that the ark is supposed to be carried with long poles of acacia wood on the shoulders of the priests. The Bible doesn't explain why David gets it wrong, but it has fatal consequences. Because the ox stumbles, the ark is falling over, and one of the soldiers reaches to prevent the ark from hitting the ground, which seems like a pretty pious gesture to me, right? And what happens? He dies. So that really puts a chill on everything, right? So David doesn't comment at that time, but here, later on, in the middle of the drought, David brings that up to Nathan. So Nathan says, thus speaks the Lord, I will withhold the rains and cause the fields and vineyards to dry up, the flocks to grow thin. I will waste the land with drought, the people with famine. Yea, I will smite Israel for its sin against me. Woe unto Israel, woe unto my people who have sinned. David says, what sin, Nathan? Nathan says, the Lord has not vouchsafed to me its nature. But evidently the sin is great, thus to incur his wrath. David's next line. Does it take so much to make him angry? That soldier who laid hands on the ark, he was only trying to be helpful. Nathan says, it's not for us to question the ways of the Lord. David says, I question nothing. Yet the sun was hot that day. The man had been drinking wine. All were excited when the ark began to fall. Is it not possible that the man might have died naturally from other causes? And Nathan says, all causes are of God. David says, we've had droughts before, Nathan. I'm buying grain in Egypt and Philistia. There will be enough until the rains come, if I have to empty my treasuries. Now, what more can I do? So you see David rebuffing Nathan's attempt to show that there's a moral basis for this drought. David says, this is just a cycle of nature. It's happened before. That doesn't sound like the biblical believer, does it? It does sound like someone who has had a crisis and he's lost his faith. Now, there's a reason why the movie does that. Because it wants to show powerfully David's return to faith. And this only happens at the climax of the film, when the people are ready to stone Bathsheba, right, as an adulterous woman. David doesn't want to allow that. So he goes into the tabernacle, he goes down on his knees and he prays. And Bathsheba's life is at stake. There were the two witnesses against her. David tried to have a kind of a legalistic, clever defense lawyer's defense. And the two witnesses were Michal. I don't know why the Bible calls her Michael. I don't know what the movie calls her Michael. The Hebrew word is Michal, who was David's first wife, played by Jackie Gleason's wife on The Honeymooners. Audrey Meadows, right? And she's got the same scowling as she has in the Jackie Gleason show. Remember that? To the moon, Alice! Remember that? So she plays that role to perfection, by the way. And Absalom is the second one, who's the witness. So there's two witnesses against Bathsheba. She's going to be stoned. Remember, we saw a woman being stoned already, earlier in the film. So for David, this is the crisis moment. Either he will transcend what he had sunk to, or there'll be a horrible ending. And that's what it takes for him to repent. That's his, I can't say come to Jesus moment, because it's 1,000 years too early, but you get the idea, right? So this is what David says. And this is his most impassioned soliloquy in the entire movie. It's near the very end, and it includes those flashbacks of his being anointed by Samuel and his fighting Goliath. By the way, what did you think of that actor who portrayed Goliath? He was a 6'8" tall Lithuanian professional wrestler. He was not a professional actor. But he didn't really need to be a professional actor for that role. He just needed to be a Hulk. Come here, little one. Remember that? So here's David's speech, and it's very powerful. David says, O God, thou God of my early youth, hear my prayer. Let thine eyes, which alone see clearly, fall upon thy worthless servant. In all things have I failed thee. My life is a waste. My crimes are many and terrible. To my sons I have bequeathed the evil that is in my blood. I have led my people into misery and want. I have used thee with ingratitude and betrayed thy trust. I have been a faithless shepherd. I am dust in the sight of thine eyes. I am less than the meanest creature crawling on the earth. And yet, O God, I am also thy creation. Take not thy Holy Spirit from me, thy Spirit which abode with me in the wilderness. I ask nothing for myself, O God. By my sins I have put myself beyond the compass of thy forgiveness. But lift thine hand from thy people who suffer for my crimes. Forgive them the sin that is not theirs, but mine. Let the land thou gavest their fathers flow once more with thine abundance. And let Bathsheba live to praise thy name and testify to thy mercy. Show her the loving kindness of thy heart. Cleanse her from sin, and let thy punishment fall on thy servant who has earned it. Look not on the sinner who comes before thee, but on the boy he was, who loved thee, and who would have died for thee. Make my heart as his. Let the boy live again in his innocence. Grant him thy mercy, and take this David's life. And he seizes hold of the ark, expecting to die, because that's what the movie has set us up to think. You hear huge thunder crashing, right? But he doesn't die. What happens is that that's the thunder of the drought ending. Huge thunderstorm ends the drought. So God responds to David's plea by sparing the people and forgiving their king. So in terms of the character of David that the movie has shown us, he's completed the arc from cynic to penitent. And God responds in mercy. Now, all of that is very 1950s. I'll tell you what I mean. 1950s was a time of widespread religious faith in the United States. Church attendance was quite high, probably higher than it's ever been since. The Congress changed the Pledge of Allegiance to add the words, under God. Right? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation. They added, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Under God was not part of it until then. Why did the US Congress change the Pledge of Allegiance? Someone wrote a letter to President Eisenhower saying, we have a flag and the atheist Soviets have a flag. We pledge allegiance to our flag and those atheist Soviets pledge allegiance to theirs. What's the difference? The difference ought to be more clear. The difference ought to show that we are a nation under God. And Congress agreed. And that's how the Pledge of Allegiance was changed. That's the mood of the nation in the early 1950s. David goes from whatever he may formally believe in God, but it doesn't mean much for him, to someone who once again is passionately walking in his faith. You see that? That's what I mean when I say this is a 1950s retelling of the King David story. Now, I also want to tell you that this is a pre-ecumenical Christian understanding of David. I need to explain that a little bit. In the 1960s, a decade and a half after this film, there were major changes in Christian-Jewish relations. One of the signal documents that showed that change was produced in the Roman Catholic world. You may have heard of the Second Vatican Council. Remember Vatican II? In 1965, one of the conciliar statements that the Vatican II, all the cardinals who were there to vote on it, that they approved, was the statement by the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, of our relationship to non-Catholic denominations and non-Christian religions. It's called Nostra Aetate, because they wrote in Latin, in our day, in our time. And that document breaks tremendous new ground in Christian, positive, sympathetic understanding of Jews as brothers, elder brothers in faith, brothers and sisters, and not simply blinded people who don't understand the mysteries of religion, who rejected God, so God rejected them. One of the key moments in this new understanding by Christianity of Judaism was the understanding that in the Hebrew Testament, it's not just strict, even vengeful justice. It's not the Hebrew God of wrath versus the Christian God of love, but rather, as we have in the book of Exodus, God tells Moses, whenever you're in trouble, whenever your people have gotten into trouble, recite this. The Lord, the eternal, long-suffering, slow to anger, merciful, forgiving the penitent, and so on and so forth. So those statements about the God of Israel are right there to see in the Bible. But for reasons that have to do with the development of Christian theology in the early centuries, after the Romans destroyed the temple, for example, it became almost a trope for Christian apologists to argue your Jewish God is a God of vengeance, a God of wrath, a God of anger, a God of no mercy. Our Christian God is a God of mercy. And that's the theology of this movie as well. So let me show you that. The adulterous woman. Right? Do you know do you know the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman in the Gospel according to John chapter 8? Okay, so Jesus defends the adulterous woman. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Remember that? So what happens to the adulterous woman in this movie? Not Bathsheba, but the one that we see when David and Bathsheba are racing home on their chariot, having so much fun after, canoodling out in the pastures, right? That we used to say that in New York City, canoodling. Do you understand what that means? It's a nice word. So they come back, and there's this woman being stoned to death. And she says, "Mercy!" And there's no mercy shown. Remember that? So David knows that that's what's going to be done to Bathsheba. In fact, when David orders Uriah to be killed, it's because he asks Uriah if he would spare Bathsheba if ever she were guilty of adultery. Now, Uriah doesn't know this, but David knows that she's already guilty of adultery. And Uriah says, "Well, it would be my duty. Of course I would fulfill my duty." At which point, David writes these orders to have Uriah be killed in battle. So that no mercy trope is very powerful in this movie. Now, at the very end, where David has not yet gone down to the tabernacle to pray, he has one moment with Bathsheba. He has his faithful guards guarding the door, and he goes in, and Bathsheba says, "David." He says, "Yes, love." She says, "In all our time together, you have never played for me." And she points to his heart that's on the wall. "Something from your boyhood, when you were a shepherd." And David recites, "The Lord is my shepherd," that famous 23rd Psalm. And then David says, "Goodness and mercy. When I wrote those words, I believed in such a God. I was only an ignorant shepherd boy. There was no one to teach me about God, so I taught myself. I saw God in the hills, in the trees, in the miracle of the birth of lambs. I felt God's mercy when the wolves had fled and my flock was safe. When spring broke the grip of snow and ice, when the cool wind blew after the heat of the day, I saw God's splendor in the flowers blazing on the hillsides and the stars burning in the sky, and I knew God's hand in everything. Then I wandered from him, and when I tried to find him again, I had lost him. Somewhere in Saul's court, or when I roamed the desert in exile, or in the camp of the Philistines, his image paled in the light of the cities, and his voice was drowned in the quarreling and scheming of the ambitious and the mighty. And now Nathan has found him for me, not the God of my boyhood days, but a God without mercy, a God who thinks only of his justice." Bathsheba says, "So you must die." And David says, "As the soldier died when he tried to save the ark from falling. He put his hands on the ark like this, Bathsheba says, "You shall not die, you shall not die." So let's analyze that dialogue. David is saying, I had a pure faith when nobody corrupted me in Sunday school. Right? Before the religious establishment taught me what they believe about God, my faith was pure. I was out in the world of nature. I saw God's glorious hand everywhere. But then somehow, in all the politics of my life, I lost God. And what God did Nathan find for me? A God with no mercy at all. So that is 1951. That wouldn't be 1971. By 1971, both Protestant and Catholic education had already gone away from that notion of Old Testament is only justice, New Testament is where you find mercy. So again, we find certain fingerprints that this movie is from the 1950s. This is in fact a caricature of the Hebrew Testament. But there's a very interesting dialogue near the very end. David is storming out to go to the tabernacle, and it's just before he has that long scene. And he's angry. Nathan says words that allow him to get past his anger. Nathan says, "You have heard the word of God." David says, "I've heard the word of Nathan. I don't believe that this is what God wants. You have told me that God demands justice. That I will believe. I will not believe that he would condemn a helpless woman for another's crime." Now, let's stop right here for a minute, because I haven't spoken about the most famous part of the movie at all, the seduction scene. First of all, David has had a spat with his wife, Michal, and he goes out onto the parapet and he sees the most famous bath in history, the bath of Bathsheba. Does she know he's looking? You bet. Does she do a little pirouette for him? Of course. Does she doesn't flaunt her assets, but she lets him know something that a woman knows how to let a man know. I don't need to say more. We're not in middle school here. We're not watching this at age 12, right? Okay. We know about those birds and bees. And in fact, in the seduction scene, at first Bathsheba says no. And then he says, well, at least I can console myself to know that you're modest. And then she says, perhaps your majesty would prefer truth to modesty. The temperature's going up right there. Do you feel that? The temperature's going up. And she says, I had to know what was in your heart. I'm not a one-night stand, David. That's not what I'm offering you. Is that in the Bible? Does Bathsheba have such a word? In the Bible, listen, the fact that the Bible doesn't say something, it doesn't mean that no one was said, but it means that the Bible has its own reasons for compressing the story and focusing on this and not focusing on that. What the Bible focuses on is David's sin. But this movie wants to have it both ways. It wants it to be both of their sins, but also for her not to be sinning. You can't have that. Right? Either they are co-conspirators or he forced her. And in this movie, he didn't force her. Right? She wanted to be loving equal with him. And she wanted his friendship. And she offers him, you'll always have my friendship. If he just wanted her friendship, they could have done what happens at the end of Shakespeare's The Tempest, right? Where the prince and the daughter of the magician are playing chess. Right? If all they wanted was friendship, they could have played a game of chess. Apparently, they wanted more than that. So you have the movie wanting to make it a romantic love story. The Bible doesn't want it to be a romantic love story. The Bible wants to focus on David's sin. Why does the Bible want that? I'll explain it to you. The books of Samuel and Kings were centuries in compilation. Starts at the time of David and Solomon, but it doesn't finish until the time of the Babylonian exile. The entire project of kingship was judged a failure because the last king, Jehoiachin, suffered the destruction of the temple and the exile of all the people to Babylon. And in Babylon, the scribes and priests and prophets who are trying to make sense of all this say, where did we go wrong? And if you think about 1 Samuel chapter 8, you know the answer. We went wrong when we asked for a king. Samuel told us, God is your king. We said, no, we want a king of flesh and blood. Even the best one is not God. So even David is not God. So that's the Bible's point. That's why the Bible doesn't try to doll it up between David and Bathsheba. He sinned. And the truth is, there was so much power imbalance that it's hard to imagine that she ever could have said no and he would have listened to that. The only words that she says in this whole section, and probably the three most important words a woman can say, are, I am pregnant. That's what she says. Not, oh, David, you need a friend. You think she's James Taylor? You got a friend. I don't think she's James Taylor. So, back to David and Nathan. David says, I will not believe he would condemn a helpless woman for another's crime. So at this point, David is finally acknowledging, I had the power in that relationship. If we had sex, I'm the one who is the guilty party. He finally recognizes that, and he says, God shouldn't be punishing her when she didn't have the choice to say no. Nathan, where are you going? David, to the tabernacle. If God is what you say he is, if this is truly his justice, then let him speak for himself. In other words, David no longer trusts that the prophets are speaking for God. That's not the Bible. Right? When Nathan says to David, you are the man. Remember Nathan's parable, the man who had one little lamb, and he fed the lamb, and she sat in his lap, and then a rich man comes and they slaughter the poor man's lamb. Remember that? And Nathan says to David, you are the man. David doesn't say in the real Bible, that's what you say, that's not what God says. Here, David says, I want to hear it straight from God. So Nathan says, will you go to him in anger? David says, he has shown me nothing but anger. He's turned his face from me. Nathan says, it was David who first turned his face from God. Once there was a David who knew how to pray, who sought nothing for himself at the hands of God, who found his strength in faith alone. If that David still lives, his God will not deny him mercy. Thank you, Martin Luther. Sola fide, right? David will access God's mercy through faith alone. See that? This is a classic pre-ecumenical understanding of the story. So notice that David isn't merely forgiven, but David is regenerated. The instrumentality of that regeneration is grace in the dynamic with faith. David prays that God will restore the pure faith that the sinner king had when he was a shepherd boy. And then lightning and thunder, and God accomplishes just that. We see that David has had a regeneration of character. He walks back into the chamber. Bathsheba is by the bed, in a classic Christian pose of prayer, right? Now I lay me down to sleep, right? And David and Bathsheba walk to the balcony where the rain is coming down, and there's a choir singing "The Lord is my shepherd." Where'd the choir come from? Cue the choir. So they go hand in hand to the balcony. Nathan has the last word. No man can ever hope to know the real nature of God, but he has given us a glimpse of his face. Powerful ending, right? So I hope that I've been able to make the case for you that this is a powerful movie. It's not the Bible straight and unvarnished, but it is the Bible through the lens of the people who were retelling this story and in the particular time and place where they were retelling it. We can actually do this kind of exercise with each film that we watch, but I've especially done it for this one. I won't do it for everyone, but I've done it for this one so that we can see how much more we can get from a Bible movie when we look at it, with a certain critical sophistication. So I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of David and Bathsheba. We have some time for questions and comments.
We have some time. What's the matter with us? It's gone. We have some time for questions. Does anyone have a question?
Usually the first one is the hardest one to get. Ma'am?
David's children.
Oh, what about David's children? I remember my 6th grade teacher in parochial school saying, David's problem was he spoiled them kids rotten. You have Amnon, who rapes his half-sister, Tamar. Then you have Absalom, her full brother, who murders Amnon. That's a doozy of a family. But again, it's not in this film so much because this film is cut down from what was originally going to be 3 times the length. You see Absalom angry because Amnon gets the field, Absalom doesn't get the field. Absalom gets the dagger presented by the Egyptian ambassador, and you see him playing with that dagger the whole time, as if it symbolizes the rebellion that he's going to make.
Anyone else? Well, we do appreciate this, but before I forgot to say that our favorite rabbi will preside over the Seder Passover dinner.
Wonderful, thank you.
So think about that for next month.
I'll have to put that on my resume, that I'm the favorite rabbi at the Chesapeake.